Well, hi guys and girls, Emma again. Welcome back to the spare room and another episode of the Patreon project. This, I guess, the next part to make is boilers. We've already got front ends looking pretty jolly good. We've got a hole through here, and there's a screw, a countersunk screw, 5mm or 3/16 5mm screw goes through there, and it screws into a hex nut, a long hex nut. The other end screws to a stay that runs through the boiler. So that's how that works, and that's what holds the front end onto the boiler. If we have a look in the book, we've got under traction engines is basically the boiler. It's got a bush in here for the safety valve and the filler. This is the long nut, which is 15mm long and 10mm or 3/8 hex. And then there's a stay rod goes through the middle, which is brass or copper, 3/16 to 165mm long. You're going to need a bit of that. You're going to need a piece of tube. This is 42mm outside diameter copper tube. That's what we need. It's a nice bit. It hasn't really got a seam or anything in it. Nice bit of tube. We're going to need some ends, so we've got a bit of, I reckon that's about 1.2. We better measure that. That's actually 1.6mm copper, so that'll be heaps good enough. We need a couple of circles cut out of that. But how big are they got to be? We could just silver solder a disc in the end, and that's not much fun. Probably for a boiler this size, they want to be properly domed and fitted in there. What you find when you buy a piece of copper is it's usually cut off with a pipe cutter. And what a pipe cutter usually does is shrink this last bit of the tube. The issue with that is that when you cut their ends and make them a nice tap fit, you tap them once more and they fall down inside and you can't get them out. So the best way is to leave or to cut your tube so that it's cut with a hacksaw and then it's full diameter and then it's parallel all the way down, and you don't have that problem, which is once you've got one end soldered in and it's all hot and you warm it up and it falls in, it's really quite a problem. I'm going to take the burr off there. And we're going to measure this inside diameter of the tube. There's a few ways we could do that. Probably inside micrometer is a good way. It doesn't have to be that accurate. I reckon a vernier is probably heaps good enough. Or a set of inside calipers if you haven't got one. And we're about 39.3 inside. We're just on 42 on the outside. So 49.3, we might write that down. Get it right, 39.3. Now, we've got to make a former. And the best way to do that is we want to measure the thickness here, which is 1.6. Double the thickness is 3.2. Less 39.3 less 3.2 is 39.1. Less 3 is 36.1mm. We'll just check that. And we've got 39.3. So that's what our formula needs to be, 36.1. A few ways you can do that. A bit of aluminium or a bit of wood is probably heaps good enough. I'm only really making 2 formers, although I might post mine to someone. And I've got a bit of aluminium there that's probably going to do the job. That's quite a bit oversized. But what I'm going to do is set that up and machine it down to 36.1, put a little bit of a radius on it and part it off. So that's pretty straightforward. I'll go and do that now. So there we go, we've got a former that's a little bit thicker than the return on the flange needs to be, or the return on the end. And I've gone and tapped an M6 hole in it, because when you get that copper snug down over the edge, that's pretty hard to get out of there, and if something to get hold of is a really good idea. So I had an M6 bolt and I had an M6 tap, so I've just tapped and drilled that in the middle. It's not something you see in any real boiler making textbook, but it's not a bad idea. You don't want to thread this down onto the copper and bend it or distort it. It's a bad idea. But if you put it in a couple of turns, you can get hold of it and pull it out, which is a good idea. Now, what diameter do these circles want to be? If you look at the drawing in the book, this is on page 23. It says 48mm diameter, to flange up and look like this. This one's got a drill in a hole in the end for the steam exit. The little stationary engine needs that. The boiler has, for the traction engine, has a hole in the middle up here, so we won't get them mixed up. This has got a 10mm hole in it for the bush, and we've got to make a bush for it, which looks something like this. It's pretty straightforward little job. But right now we need to make a couple of flanged end plates. To me, 48mm seems like a really good idea, because I can get a 48mm circle out of there. Put this in here so we don't lose it. Or if we do lose it, we lose both of them. Now we need a 48mm circle out of here. And the best way to do that is just with a combination square. Just from the corner there, we scribe a line across there, and from the other corner, that'll get that nicely in the middle there. We're going to do the same with this side. Because these need a hole in them anyway, we won't be so nervous about centre punching them. And if we set up our dividers to half of 48 is 24. There's a bit of maths involved in machining. I've had this conversation with people recently. Don't be scared of it, don't be afraid of it. You should be able to, by now, to divide things by half and by quarters. But half of 48 is 24. Just like that. We'll scribe a circle around here. This is 36.1, and we need to scribe another circle at half of that, which is 18 approximately. And we'll scribe another circle in there. And all that's for is to line the blank up when we've annealed the copper, and we need to set the former up in the centre to start forming it. Once it's had a few taps round, it'll be very easy to locate in the same position every time, but until we do that, we need something to line the former up there. So that's what that inside line's for. Next job is to cut these out. This is 1.6, so you're really going to struggle to cut that with your with your tin snips. What I'm going to do is just scribe a line along there, just this side of the circle, and I'm going to cut these off with a hacksaw. So I've cut most of the excess off these. They're nearly down to, oh well, they're getting close to the line, the two formers. What I'm going to do, and probably the easiest way to deal with these, is to put them in a vise with a couple of bits of wood and just file them around the line. That's pretty quick and easy. It'll only take you 10 minutes to do it, you know. It's one of those jobs, filing things, you put it off and think there's got to be a better way. Oh, can I set it up in the lathe? Can I do this? Can I do that? And yes, absolutely you can. But it's going to take 10 minutes with a file, and it's going to be heaps good enough. I've got a set of hand nibblers. Which look like these if you can get them, or an electric set or whatever. These are pretty hard work, but they will cut this copper if you don't take too much at a time. And that's what I'm going to do, is just nibble them round to the line nice and carefully. And it'll take probably the same amount of time as filing them, but it's not a bad little job. And either way, I'll be back when they're round. So what we've got is a huge mess, usually. A lot of either copper chips or filings or whatever that need to be vacuumed up. And we've got two discs that are 48mm diameter. Now they're the ends of your boilers. That's the hard bit done, really. This inside circle here will line up on the former nicely, so it's in the middle. Right. And what we need to do is hold them in the vise and just tap this around until it gets a bit difficult to move, and then we're going to anneal it and do it again. And do it again. I reckon I only need about 3 or 4 times. And we're set. First thing we really need though is some pickle. Plastic bucket that the boiler will fit in is a good start. And I'm just going to use citric acid off the supermarket shelf because that's the cheapest and easiest and the least nasty chemical for me to use, and it's just as effective. It might take you a little bit longer, but it works. I've got a nice neat fitting lid for that too, with clips on it. So it's not going to get spilled everywhere. It's not going to get too many contaminants in it. If we drop our pieces in here, and I'm going to leave them for a half hour or so. Probably the piece of copper for that too. And while we're doing that, I'm going to cut these. So we can cut it with pipe cutters. I've already said that that's probably not a real smart idea. The best thing to do with this copper tube needs to be 140mm long. I'm not going to waste any tube and cut that piece off. If I solder this end in first and then we solder the other end, we won't have any more problems. So it's all about thinking how you're going to do things. So the best thing to do, I've taken that burr off there, the best thing to do is just to mark this out at 140 long. And I'm just going to mark it with a Sharpie there. Now how do we mark this round here? You could get the square and you can mark as you go right round there, and that's probably alright too. And the quickest, best and easiest way is just to use a sheet of writing paper. You want to tear one side of it off like that, nice and rough, right? That way we know that one side's square and one side isn't. What I mean is, if you cut this across here with the scissors, so you've got a strip of writing paper, when you come back to look at it, you haven't got a clue which is the original edge and which end is the edge you cut. So it's very easy to get it out of line like that. If we roll this up and we look down the side there so that we can see that line of copper, and get the sheet of paper nice and parallel to that, and then wrap it round so that it lines up like that, just on the back. What we've got is a perfectly square line. If we just run around that with the Sharpie against the edge, we've got a line to cut to. So that's pretty straightforward, easy thing to do. Remember which side of the line we want to save. We're going to cut up to this line with a hacksaw in the vise, and we're just going to file up to it, and then we should have a nice square side or a nice square end to make it use as a basis for our boiler. So there we go. It's fairly easy to file down to that line. If we just hold this end nice and square on the bench like that, give it a rub and deburr and check it with a file as we go, as we check it with a square as we go, that's what we end up with. A bit at a time. We'll take that burr out of there. And off the outside. This piece needs a couple of holes in it, and that's pretty straightforward. If we look at there's a hole for the 8th pipe, which is 45mm from one end, and in the other end, back here on page 23, there's a hole here that's 12mm from the end and 10mm hole. So a step bit's probably the easiest way to put that one in. There's a few ways we could mark this out. I'm probably just going to do this. Because everything's on the same plane, and one's a pipe that goes to the engine, and it's going to be soft soldered, silver soldered in. Another one's a bush that's got to be somewhere near straight. But there's not much to that. So if we set this up 12mm from one end, there, and 45 from the other, like that. I'm going to sit these on a V block to do them. There's a few ways you could do it. You could hold it endways in a vise if you've got a milling vise. You can make a wooden V block, which is probably plenty good enough for this. You could set it up in the chuck in the lathe and cross drill it. You could use your dividing head in the milling machine and drill it that way. You could probably sit it in the slot on your milling table to hold it, is probably a good way too. Or in the slot on your drilling table to hold it. And that's a good way to get it set up. We don't have to drill right through, so we're only going to drill one hole here and one hole here. This one's 1/8 and this one's 10mm. So we've got a bit of pipe here. Now, you might have some tube that looks about the right size. This is probably 5/32 rather than 1/8. And for that reason, I'm going to measure it before I drill that hole. And yep, that's 5/32. And that's what I'm going to use. As it so happens, my step drill's got both those sizes on it. It's 3/8 and 5/32. So I'm going to drill that to the first step, then drill this one down to the 10mm step. That's actually 3/8, but that won't hurt. We'll make the bush to fit. And when we've got those holes nicely aligned, I'm just going to deburr them. Now in the book there's a special jig that you make, which is the same diameter as the inside of the tube with a flat on it. And what that does is you can hold that in the vise, you can sit that on it, and you can flatten this piece here so that the bush sits nice and square. And that's not a bad idea. I haven't done that because I'm pretty confident that I can just make this bush a nice fit in here and sit it in and solder around it, and it's not going to move. Rub around the inside with a half round file just to take the burrs off, and we can probably get something to move that Sharpie because solder won't stick to Sharpie. And we got the boiler barrel ready to drop in the pickle too. So by now these other ends should be somewhere near sort of good. This will sting a bit if you put your hand in, and if your container's too deep, it's going to overflow and make a mess. So best way probably is just to lift them up like that to get them out, or put them in a basket, if plastic sieve or something like that, a plastic basket, drop them in that. If you've got cuts on your hands, this stuff will sting a bit. Not quite as much as sulfuric acid, which you would never ever put your hand into, but it will sting a little bit. And they're coming up nice and pink and clean, so they're about ready to start work on. Now, we've got our template, we've got the two ends, we've got our tube and our pipe all in the pickle, and the next job really, we need to get the hearth out, or a piece of fire brick, something like that. And we'll set these up ready to anneal. I reckon these are soft enough now though to bend the first time. So if we come around here to the vise, my good vise, which has got really bad lighting, and hopefully we've got some sort of a camera set up so you can see. And we line that up to the line there so it's nice and central. And put that in the vise there. Just find a hammer. Give that a bit of a tap around like that, and without letting go of that, move it round half a turn and do the same. That's probably about all we're going to get the first time. And you find that that's a fairly nice neat bend there, and you can always locate that back on centre. So I'm going to do both of them like that, and we'll have a look at annealing them. Now I'm going to do most of the work with this Primus blow lamp, which is just straight on LPG bottle. This seems to be really good with this big tip for copper and boiler work. It gets hot enough for this sort of work. A bigger boiler, like a locomotive boiler, you're going to find that this torch is going to be a useful thing, but it's not going to get enough localized heat into a joint to solder it with a bit more mass. But for this it's great. So to anneal these, you turn this on, and we're going to get a bit harder hearing here. I want to bring them up until they're about dull red, and I'm going to quench them out. There'll be someone who will comment, because there always is, that there's no need to quench copper out to anneal it, and that's very true. However, it takes a lot longer to cool down than it does to heat up. So I haven't got all night to wait for it. So they should be good and soft again, and if they're cooled off, we can go round again and we can beat them into submission and see how much further we can get them. So I've gone round them again off camera, and that gives you some idea how much further it's gone that time. Another anneal session and a clean up, and they'll be getting very, very close. So that's been annealed the second time. We'll get our former, and that'll just drop back in there nicely. Just move him about 1/8 of a turn, something like that. You'll hear the difference when it comes down onto the former. Have a look, there's still a bump there. And that's all the way round. This is where our tapped hole comes in handy, because we can put that in there and we can just lift that out. Whereas if you try and get that out with your fingernails, it's a bit of an ordeal actually. That's starting to look pretty good, and there's minimum of work. It's taken me to get them both to that stage. It's only going to have taken me probably ½ hour, and that still falls out, so it's a little bit not quite tight enough, I don't think. If we have a look, that won't go in the end there yet. Probably if we tapped it, it would, but it'd stretch the tube out and it'd look a bit ugly. So one last time, I'm going to anneal them now, and we're going to tap them into submission and probably give them a clean up with a file drill the holes in the centre and drop them in the pickle. So these have been annealed again, and that's just the same process. Get them hot so that the colour's fluid across them when you wave the torch over, so they go from clear to dark to clear to dark, and that's probably about the right heat. Looking at the boiler barrel that we've pulled out of the pickle, these aren't far off moving in there, so we'll just gently tap them all the way around. And that's just about going to fit in there, so we're going to call that done. You can pull that out. We've got a nice sharp corner on the inside, which is what we want, and a nice neat radius on the outside. These are probably going to get a bit of a clean up because they've got a few hammer marks and things in them. We'll do the same with this one. And that's a pretty good fit. If when we finish they're a bit loose, we can expand them back out again. That's not a big deal, so don't stress too much about it. But I reckon they'll both go in there nicely with a bit of a file up. Best way to clean them up is just on the former. And we'll drop them back in the vise. Of course we can't get that out again. And I reckon that's a pretty good fit there. It will go in, but it's going to require a bit of a tap, and that's where we want to be really. So there we go. They need a hole in the centre just to match the piece of bar, which is 5/16, which is 3/16 or 5mm, depending on what you got. Measure it first and then drill them. And these could do with a file off on the back, so just to rub with a file just to clean them up and deburr them. And a bit of a rub on the front too to take the ugly bits off. Let's do that, have another look at them. Well, there we go. We've got 2 end caps, which are looking pretty good. They just come out of the pickle. They could do with a bit more in there, perhaps, just to clean them up. And we've got a tube with the holes in it, and we've got a piece of tube to go in here for the steam to the engine. It's all pretty straightforward. The things that we need to make is a stay to go through the middle, which goes through this hole in the centre here, with a nut on each end, and that's all silver soldered in place. And we still need to make a bush for the boiler, for the safety valve and the filler. That's pretty straightforward. We'll talk about them in more depth in the next video. Apart from that, it's ready to go. Can all go back in the pickle for a bit. And I'm really happy with them. Next video we're going to need some silver solder and some silver solder flux. Just about any silver solder flux will do if it's a recognised good brand. And some 45% is preferable because for a couple of reasons. One, it's got the lowest melting point. For 2, it's the most plastic, so it'll flow around your joints the best. And for 3, when it cools, it's a bright shiny finish rather than a a dull, boring finish. So it's worth getting some silver solder, some 45%, and air conditioning supplies or air conditioning agents are probably the best place to buy it. Here in Australia, Actual Parts. So anyway, I think that's all for tonight. We'll get on to the putting it together and making some more bits soon. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe and all that sort of stuff if you're watching this on YouTube. If you're watching it on Patreon, big thanks to everyone who puts their money in the hat to keep these going and to give me a bit of incentive to build things like this. Really appreciate that. So without saying any more, big thanks and be kind to each other, and more soon, guys and girls.